Welcome to tonight's episode of MHNR 2020.
Welcome to tonight's episode of MHNR 2020.
Welcome everyone to tonight's episode of MHNR 2020.
Welcome to tonight's episode of MHNR 2020.
Welcome to tonight's episode of MHNR 2020.
Hello everybody, welcome to MHTV, but also MHTV at MHNR. So it's a lot of letters, but what we're doing is this is our first broadcast of the MHNR conference. I will hand over to Vanessa in a second, just so that you can start to follow us on Twitter and on Facebook and understand quite what it is that we're doing. But for those of you who haven't sort of been looking to see how we're going to be progressing over the next couple of weeks, what we're doing is we can't meet and have our normal conference. So all the kind of tribes of mental health normally get together. We share all our ideas, our good practice, and we do what we can to move forward as a community of mental health practice. They can't do that this year because of COVID, but it's really important that we stay communicating with each other, celebrating each other's good work, and really part of a team, because we are part of a team. And I think this whole situation can make us feel quite atomized. So what we want to do is come together with you online, us in our various parts all over the country, and actually start talking about, the kind of stuff that affects our hearts, our minds, our practice to do with mental health. So in a second, I'll introduce you to our fantastic first panel, and I hope you give them lots of love. But before I do that, let me just hand over to Vanessa, my usual co-host, to say a little bit about the kind of social media and how you can participate over the next couple of weeks. Vanessa?
Hello everyone. As Nikki says, we're really excited to be hosting the Mental Health Nursing Research Conference over the next couple of weeks. And as Nikki's pointed out, we're doing it online, but I actually think that's a great opportunity because it means that it's much more accessible this year. Anybody can join in, whether you work in mental health, whether you're a researcher, whether you've just got an interest in mental health and you just happen to come across the event. We would encourage you to join in. You can do that in one of two ways. You can either join in if you're into Twitter. We usually have the MHTV hashtag. So just to say, tonight's hashtag is MHNR 2020. So if you follow that hashtag, I will try and keep an eye on the other hashtag as well in case people tweet us there. You can follow the conversation there, or you can ask questions of the panel as we go along. If you prefer Facebook or you want to do a bit of both, if you head over to the Unite MHNA Facebook page, you just literally need to like the page and the live stream will appear in your news feed, and there's a comments box, and we would love your questions and comments, which we'll feed in as we go along.
Okay, so let me introduce you to our fantastic panel. So first up, Elisa, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work?
Hello, my name is Elisa Thompson. I'm a mental health nurse and a nurse researcher. I work for Sheffield Health and Social Care, work in the CMHT 2 days a week, and the rest of the week I work in the research department. So there's a little bit of crossover with both roles. My interest is in sort of complex trauma or EUPD, BPD type presentations or diagnosis.
Yeah. And this is all grouped together under the idea of kind of community health. So can I come to Sarah next?
Hi, my name is Sarah Amani, and I'm a mental health nurse who works as a senior program manager for the South of England Early Intervention and Psychosis Program, which is sponsored by NHS England. My area of interest has been for, I would say, the last 15 years, psychosis and particularly early intervention and prevention work. And yeah, happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. And Nick, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi there, my name's Nick Weaver, a mental health nurse, also a lecturer at Cardiff University. My interests, which really focused on in my PhD thesis, is on recovery in all its many shapes and forms, the impact that recovery implementation or experiences can have on care continuity, and the wider effects that this can have on services.
Thank you very much. That's fantastic. So let me hand you over now to the person who's going to be in charge of today's session, a fabulous guest presenter. Mick, can you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Nikki. My name's Mick McKeown. I'm a professor of democratic mental health at the University of Central Lancashire. And my little joke that's probably a bit careworn now is if you find any democratic mental health, can you let me know? Now, we've probably all listened to everyone's presentations and the fine bunch of presentations that we've had. And I think there's a few sort of common themes there that we'll maybe pick up later. But maybe we'll start with Elisa. I detected a little bit of discomfort at the start of your presentation with the sort of terminology that we have in clinical mental health care, and maybe some of the labels that are attached to the client group that you're trying to support. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, when I actually submitted my abstract initially, I'm a clinician and I was using quite a lot of clinical and diagnostic language, and I got some feedback from the conference to sort of challenge that a little bit. And then I did discuss that with some of my peers and some people who use services. And I mean, I think when you're a clinician, you get drawn into that use of language, don't you? And obviously, you know, discussing that with my peers and with people who use services, it was quite clear to me the diagnostic language. There's some challenges, there's some difficulties, and I don't feel like it really accurately sort of represents the experiences of people who use services, and I'm aware that I can get drawn back into that language, but that throughout my scoping review, the findings sort of signified that language is used very heavily, and people who use services probably don't feel comfortable, and there's quite a lot of, you know, language of power to in Foucauldian terms, and that it's quite difficult really for people who navigate those services and use those services to sort of have their own identity really outside of the, you know, the terminology, and that comes along quite rigid pathways and stigma and things like that. So I think that very much became a part of my review, really looking at the language that we use in clinical services, but also that's used really heavily in research, and you know, maybe we need to look outside of those diagnostic labels and what are the actual experiences behind the presentations that we work with.
Yeah, thanks, Elisa. I mean, there's maybe a little bit of an irony as well, isn't there? I mean, how do you go about doing a review if you don't rely on the terminology that's already out there?
Oh yeah, I mean, I did. So in my inclusion and exclusion criteria, I used the terminology. So EUPD, BPD, CPTSD, but because obviously I wouldn't have picked up any literature. But then in my sort of discussion, I was thinking about how can we sort of unpick some of this language and moving forward research. So how can we think about, you know, working outside of this language, and, you know, is it possible, and how can we bridge the gap really between sort of rigid diagnostic clinical services and people who use services and the language they would prefer to identify with.
It sort of struck me as well, and I think this is where there's a resonance with some of the other presentations, that one of the ways you've detected a shift is towards the language of complex trauma rather than the previous diagnostic labels. And you also acknowledged that you had some concerns about trauma that's caused in services, so services that do harm. And I think there was a little bit of that in Nick's presentation as well. So maybe try and bring Nick in here.
Yeah. I think, well, picking up on that kind of perspective, one of the sort of conclusions that I made from my research was very much the idea that recovery is seen as a sort of generally benevolent thing, a sort of panacea for all ills, no matter how poorly or well it's implemented. And my study was qualitative analysis, and I did discourse analysis. And one of the key themes that was generated in that analysis was that there were competing versions of recovery, that participants had lots of different versions of recovery, lots of different ideas and agendas about what recovery might be. And I think David Pilgrim has called recovery a polyvalent concept, and it can, in fact, mean all things to all people. So there was a difficulty there with what recovery is. And I connected that with service fragmentation and discontinuities of care, which service users talked about. This was in Wales, in Welsh services, in the context of the implementation of the Mental Health Wales measure, which is ostensibly about recovery implementation. And it seemed that whilst one might think sort of instinctively recovery is a good thing, firstly, having lots of different types of recovery can actually be associated with fragmentation of services and potentially lead to discontinuities of care. So that was one of my arguments. But The other key argument that I really brought in was really building on the insights of recovery in the bin. I think it was in this conference last year, and the idea of neo-recovery. And I think Angela Woods in the paper has spoken about, written about top-down recovery, which is a sort of parallel term for a similar concept. And neo-recovery really is the idea that there is a brand of recovery, particularly implemented in policy, which is very, very heavily influenced by neoliberalist ideology. So neo and recovery brings those two terms together. And neoliberalism is really a very dominant ideology today, but broadly speaking, it has to do with free market principles and freedom, which is really understood entirely in terms of money. And of course, there are a lot of people will argue, well, actually, neoliberalism doesn't create true freedom. So I applied that, and Recovery in the Bin have applied that to the understanding of recovery, and that this top-down neo-recovery really is aimed at getting people back to work, getting people to be positive, to recover, and there's no freedom to not recover. So it becomes almost a form of a coercive thing, but in a much more subtle way than the sort of traditional forms of coercion that you would find with institutions. And so neo-recovery was in many ways could be seen as a type of recovery which is sort of hoisted onto service users and can become burdensome. And it's certainly a narrow interpretation of recovery. And I think perhaps the narrow interpretation of recovery with the measure I argued was the idea that service users should be really discharged to primary care, to the GP, and that they should be self-sufficient and stand on their own 2 feet. And I argued that was a form of neo-recovery and potentially quite a narrow and a reductive understanding of recovery, and not necessarily a good thing, and certainly not reflective of the broad palette of what recovery can be for the person with mental health issues.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots there, Nick. I think we could talk all day on this, couldn't we? I'm sort of thinking about how we might strike some balance between a sort of oppressive neoliberalism that shreds what we would recognise as public services and the welfare state, and the possibly more authentic desire to actually help people who are in mental distress, and maybe to do that at the scale of the state so that people don't slip through the net. And at that point, I want to turn to Sarah, because Sarah's presentation was about the use of mobile phone technology. And I think maybe that technology speaks of both those directions at once. You know, is it a way of keeping people under the control of statutory services, or is it in some way more emancipatory and giving people more say in their own lives? So where would you come in on those sorts of arguments, Sarah?
Thanks, Mick. I think it's a really good question. I think in the study that was led by Professor Sonia Johnson and her team at UCL, which studied the My Journey app, which I developed in 2012, there was a sort of semi-structured interview element to it for the qualitative results. So participants were interviewed to kind of share their views, and it was 50-50 actually. Some participants kind of felt really wary about putting their data into a mobile device, and not necessarily to do with their paranoia, but really just worried about what might happen to that data in future. Whilst the other half were actually thinking, yeah, this gives me more power, because instead of the clinician writing my care plan in their words with their kind of lens, I can write my own symptoms and my plan and the things that are important to me. And I can drive the care that I receive by doing that. So it was a mixture, actually, of both those kind of views.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of a little piece that Diana Rose, the survivor researcher, wrote at the height of the COVID pandemic. And she was sort of saying that most of the time you want to escape the clutches of services, but when you know you can't have them, you maybe miss some of these people as well. And a colleague of mine at University of Central Lancashire, a fellow called Nadeem Gere, he did a similar study to yours, Sarah. And one of the little quotes that came out of the service users who'd been using this app was, "It's just like having my care coordinator in my pocket." And I thought that was quite neat. And it was sort of counterintuitive for me, because I was thinking, oh, this is very Big Brother, isn't it? Sort of you're getting tracked by your mobile phone and all of this. And yet for those people who cooperated with it, it wasn't at all. They didn't have, those thoughts about it. But I suppose we could all have a think about what are the issues in services across the piece that either promote cooperation or refusal to cooperate. Because I think there's a little resonance on that binary across all the presentation. So maybe come back to Elisa, and maybe this coalesces around the labels and how they might alienate people, and maybe other aspects of services. But in your experience or in your review, did you find anything that would help us make more sense of cooperation and refusal in contemporary care?
Yeah, I mean, I think it sort of comes down to sort of how helpful people find services. So in my review, people with autistic experience generally have different needs to people who don't, or are sort of more high functioning, for example, or don't have an autistic experience, and that services aren't really geared towards their needs. And then unfortunately, people trying to use services are then don't feel able to engage in the way that sort of we want them to, or they feel able to. And this can get quite sort of complicated. There was some suggestion in the literature as well that people with autism, particularly females, are regularly diagnosed with BPD or EUPD. And that again, these are particularly quite rigid pathways, and there's quite a lot of stigma attached within staff as well to those labels. So those young women, for example, weren't experiencing a service that was helpful to them, and quite understandably, resisted that services, and their family found that that those labels didn't really adequately describe the experiences of those people, and that what was offered to them wasn't helpful. And the way people with autistic experience may feel that they need to communicate was labelled or misinterpreted as something else under the guise of, for example, BPD or EUPD. So I think going back to sort of what you said, the resistance there is around, it's not actually helpful. People don't feel listened to, people don't feel understood, and understandably they push back against that. And what can we do really to sort of better formulate and understand people's difficulties, rather than sort of putting them into a box that doesn't really sort of fit with their experiences.
Right, thanks. And I don't suppose that's unique to the client group that you're working with either, Elisa. I mean, maybe if I come back to Nick, I think one of the strengths in your presentation, Nick, is a heavily sociological, some very sort of dense theory there, and a very, very neat, I think, interweaving of different theoretical perspectives. If we were to take a sociological look at some of these issues, what sort of sense would you make of this idea of, say, service users, service refusers? What's the place of recovery in the bin in a wider discourse of critique of care?
I think before sort of making a sort of theoretical point, I think it's always helpful to sort of ground things in the real world, and my colleagues presenting here, certainly their research is that, and so I'm reminded of one of my participants, and his pseudonym was Dylan, and he was an expert patient, a service user, and also he provided recovery training for other service users, but he had almost a sort of a cynical attitude towards services, and actually said that what's probably best to do in his interview, he said, is to pay lip services to services and basically find your own way of recovering. So perhaps that ties into this idea of refusal. At the same time, I think it is true to say that in some cases, people did find services helpful. And so just looking at a sort of theoretical perspective, because I was going down that line, I was able to look at grassroots recovery and near recovery, and actually almost try and say, there are benefits with both. And actually, just looking at it from the point of view of complexity theory, if you have perhaps too much of an emphasis on grassroots recovery, that can generate complexity. So you just have so many different ideas of what recovery is. It can create a very escalating, complex situation in services. But conversely, an overemphasis on near recovery, and I brought in the perspective of Jürgen Habermas here, the idea of colonization of the life world. So the idea of recovery being colonized, I specifically attached to the idea of colonization of the life world, and that near recovery really comes from the systemic sphere, or of the sphere of strategic action, and that this can also be a factor for complexity, which is so much the case when lived experience is turned into something which is systemic. You only have to look at the global financial markets and the complexity there. And so really, one of my key arguments was that this polarization, either to grassroots recovery or to near recovery, can be problematic in terms of complexity. So why not offset the two trends against one another, which is that near recovery, in a limited way, not allowing it to become dominant, can actually set parameters for grassroots recovery. Similarly, grassroots recovery is encouraged and allowed to flourish, and near recovery isn't allowed to become overly dominant as a factor. So I think that was largely a sort of critical psychiatry perspective, as opposed to anti-psychiatry, which argues against psychiatry. Completely we shouldn't have medicalization or neoliberal elements at all. But really accepting that there has to be a degree of systematization because society is so complex, and I think Habermas argues that. But not allowing that to become dominant. Near recovery should not become a dominant factor, and so I was really arguing for that kind of balancing of grassroots recovery and near recovery as an overarching strategy.
So I love that answer, and I think Habermas, what I take from him is this atavistic rejection of the idea of dominance, and how can we work our way around it and get to maybe like a better world that doesn't have a tendency to dominate. And I think it's also quite neat that the communicative approach, this sort of communicative rationality, is averse to binaries. So there's a number of binaries here that we're trying to sort of escape in a complex world, and that it would be daft to think that, given the complexity of mental distress, there'd be any one set of solutions that served everybody. And I think this brings me back to Sarah's work. So I think one of the binaries that's out there is this, and again, it's a sort of pivots on a sort of neoliberal critique, is that the idea of self-help is being completely co-opted to neoliberal ends. And that, if we looked, for instance, at proposed digital solutions, they tend towards a sort of privileging of autonomous people who help themselves, and that then, like Nick has told us, can be a justification for retracting services. So, but I don't think that's where it's necessarily at with the app. So would you like to come in there, Sarah, and maybe develop a defense of the app that virtue of self-help?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a risk here, isn't there, of using these new tools to justify excluding people from services, so they can do the very opposite of what they intend, which is to help people manage when they're not in a clinical setting. The study that I and others worked on with this mobile health app didn't actually look at that specifically. But what I will share is the fact that psychosis services have been subject to targets since 2016 to see people within 2 weeks for assessment and deliver NICE interventions. And the third bit was also to extend the age range from the original 14 to 35 to 14 to 65. So what we expected from 2016 till now would have been a 35% increase in caseloads. But what's happening is actually the opposite. the caseloads are actually reducing. So this is, for me, I think it talks to a bit of what you and Nick were talking about with the sometimes misuse of the word recovery. So almost imposing our views on people to say, actually, I think you're okay now, you can go. You don't need us anymore. And I do wonder, and there's no evidence that I can pull on, whether that is actually happening with early intervention and psychosis services, because the primary aim now is to see people very quickly within 2 weeks when they're referred, but nobody's checking about what's actually happening thereafter.
So thanks, Sarah. I mean, I think we're going to have digitally supported services, whatever happens. So I think maybe where this conversation takes us is, can we have our cake and eat it, and have the ones that are most in tune with what people want? And maybe one of the things that's wrong with mental health care presently and in its near past, or maybe in its entire history, has been a complete absence of choice of alternatives to sort of physical containment and medication, maybe a little bit of psychotherapy thrown in if you're lucky. But even that, virtually sort of homogenous these days, not so much choice around the edges. So maybe the proliferation of the digital, as long as it doesn't squeeze out the relational, I think that's a big one, is a way of accessing more of what people might want, or different things that suit different people. Now, Nikki has been giving me a prompt to say that we've got some questions coming in via the interweb.
Students, yeah, thank you. I just want to say thank you so much for the students who are watching along and getting involved. So obviously what we're doing tonight is this is in place of our conference, but hopefully you'll be watching this, seeing what the presenters here are doing, and actually deciding in a year, couple of years, maybe even now, you can team up and actually start to put something in for next year. So what we'd really love to see is as many different people getting involved in sort of generating knowledge and understanding as possible. So I actually have a ton of student questions. I said, could you send me some? And you sent me a lot. So thank you very much. And obviously, I think some people have been watching your videos as well, presenters. So thank you very much. There's some questions that definitely speak to some homework being done. I know I'm shocked too. So there's a lot of them. So how about I read them all out and then we go through them slowly and decide who wants to answer what. So one person wants to know, why do people resist services? That's a good question. I'm going to rephrase this because the word banging on about has been used, but I can see where they're going. So basically, what's neoliberalism? Everyone keeps talking about it. What's it got to do with health? Somebody wants to know what discourse analysis is. I think that's coming straight at you, Nick. And also complex trauma. So I think maybe this might be one for Alyssa, talking about isn't all trauma complex? Okay, so should we go back to the start? Maybe why do some people resist services? Because I think when you're first starting off as a student nurse, you're trying really hard to do the right thing, and it maybe feels a bit baffling that people maybe are less enthusiastic than you are. So anyone who fancies that one.
I mean, I could just start by saying that there is this whole concept of iatrogenesis, which is the idea, or the notion that a treatment can actually do harm, and there seems to be a real sensitivity to this within mental health, where arguably the use of psychopharmaceuticals, ECT, all of which are treatments, coercive force, all of these ways of dealing with people who are struggling with mental health issues, actually can do more harm than good. And certainly even in a more subtle way, today, there's certainly among some service users and service users that I interviewed, is a sense of actually wanting to avoid services, and that services might actually be problematic, and actually hold them back in some way. And so that might be a reason why people would want to resist services, because they may not actually have a good effect as perceived by the service user.
Yeah, so not everything works out. Did either of you guys want to add to that, Elisa or Sarah?
Yeah, I'd add, I think also there's something about how mental health services are reported on in the media, or what we see from, well, as young as, or as soon as we can read or watch TV, really. The stories that we read or see are usually something that's gone wrong in mental health services. So for those who are new to services, if that's all they know, or that's what they're gleaning is going to be their experience, then it shouldn't be that surprising, I suppose, that some people might be reluctant. And then I suppose there are also some groups who have mistrust of, I suppose, mental health services because of historical things. I'm thinking in particular Black and ethnic minority groups, and the dodgy role that psychiatry and psychology has played in actually discriminating those groups might also lead to some reluctance to engage.
Absolutely. So isn't all trauma complex? So anyone want to have a go at that?
That's a really good question, actually, and I don't know how well I'm going to be able to answer that. So when I'm talking about complex trauma, I guess it's in the sense of people who've had trauma and then again, thinking about iatrogenic harm, and their engagement with services may then sort of lead to some re-traumatization. I think a lot of the people I work with, the colleagues that I work with, most of the colleagues that I work with are very, very kind, caring. They want to help people, but the way services are structured and possibly like a lack of evidence base in some areas may mean that actually what we're doing is making people feel worse. In terms of complex trauma, people who are diagnosed with sort of EUPD, BPD, personality disorder labels, a better way of sort of conceptualizing that, I feel, is complex trauma. A lot of people who experience mental health, schizophrenia, bipolar, there is a trauma history behind that. In terms of sort of EUPD, the complex trauma has. Again, I'm trying to say this in a way that isn't sort of like, stigmatizing, that may have had an impact on someone's personality development, which then has an impact on their ability to navigate services as they are, if that makes sense. So that, for me, that is my understanding of complex trauma, something that lies behind the EUPD, the PD type diagnosis. Another way of talking about personality disorder is emotional sensitivity, which I think is a really good way. I think just to move away from that disorder label, to recognise the experiences and the traumatic experiences people have endured, really, rather than blaming them for the way they present and behave, if that makes sense.
Well, you're making a really valid point that really links back to what everyone else has been saying, isn't it? And in our everyday lives, we understand that if we call people names, they won't want to hang out with us. In our professional lives, we do all the time. Like, I seem a bit off. It's odd. I suppose discourse analysis. Are you feeling up to that, Nick? What is it, and how do you make information out of it?
Well, I mean, it's probably slightly more interesting, just very, very briefly, just to tell the story of why I ended up doing discourse analysis, why I chose to do it. I was originally going to do thematic analysis after Brown and Clark, and really felt that I, certainly as part of this qualitative research, that I wanted to draw on a major analytic tradition. And so I looked at various analytic traditions, grounded theory, conversational analysis, and really adopted discourse analysis because of my interest in constructionism as a philosophical perspective, which is kind of the idea that we construct meanings and realities in our everyday talk and language and meaning-making activities. And discourse analysis, so I was very interested in that perspective, really, in constructionism, and so was my supervisor, Professor Michael Coffey, and discourse analysis really fitted with that, and it's really basically a way of understanding how people use language, use talk, to construct perspectives and meanings of the world and their own positions in relation to that. That can have political ramifications, as with Lacan, Mouffe's discourse theory and Verkloff's critical discourse analysis. But this really helped me with my analysis of recovery, because I was able to draw on Lacan, Mouffe's concept of a floating signifier, and actually say, or as well as David Bunkram saying that recovery is a polyvalent concept, or maybe recovery is a floating signifier. It's a sign that hasn't had its meaning fixed, and actually there's a political process of different groups and people struggling to fix the meaning of recovery, particularly neoliberal forces, policymakers, and this co-option and appropriation of recovery becoming a form of potentially of oppression.
So you're almost saying there's something about who owns language, then, isn't there? Who gets to define their own experience, and this links very much into what Elisa and Sarah have both been saying, isn't it? About if you can describe your illness and say what your experience is, even if you don't want to say that it's an illness, if you want to say that it's a life experience or a way of understanding life, that may make you feel differently about, and also change your possibilities in the way that you can see your future. Whereas if you're named and controlled by maybe a force outside of that, you have a very different kind of experience. And this idea about floating concepts as well is really useful, because we see this all the time in mental health, doesn't it? Language goes and comes back. And so I think this is something that maybe students experience, is that one word tends to mean all kinds of different things. And it can be quite confusing, I think, if you're trying to understand. Whereas if you understand, actually, some words, it's in whose interest that these words float around. It's in whose interest that these words are defined. And it gets to be, you get to start to think about what you're doing instead of just doing the tasks one after another. And I think that's really interesting.
Analysis really tackles that head on, the way in which language can be used, particularly to empower or disempower. And I think in George Orwell's 1984, that was sort of one of the final clinchers for oppression there was the takeover of language itself.
Absolutely.
So I would certainly have that view that the control of language is particularly important.
I think you're setting up a reading list as well for us there, Nick. The conference reading list now. Start with 1984. Strangely prescient in today's society. Depressingly so. So and it kind of takes us around to one more thing, and then I'll hand back over to Mick, obviously, which is who wants to have a crack at why should we care about neoliberalism if we're health workers? What's it got to do with mental health?
Well, I think neoliberalism's tremendously important, generally speaking, for anyone living in modern or late modern society, because it is the dominant ideology and it affects everything. And it's very helpful to understand that, to understand what's going on politically. Neoliberalism, as I think I've said before, is the promotion of the market, of market systems, and as the supreme system of power and the functionality of society. And it has quite a reductionistic understanding of the human being as really a self-interested agent making choices, potentially greedy choices within that system. So it's highly controversial, and it affects healthcare greatly, I believe, and there are many instances of that. Just focusing on our area of expertise, mental health, there's a lot of evidence that the recovery implementation and policy-based recovery implementation is tremendously influenced by neoliberalist ideology, and arguably the mental health Wales measure in Wales is one instance of that, because of its emphasis on shifting people to primary care, which the overall context of austerity, which affected the whole of the UK over the past decade.
Okay. Either of you guys want to add to that?
I would just say, I think when I started my career in mental health, I had a particular sort of view around sort of social justice and things, and then as I sort of progressed, particularly in the CMHT, I guess, the language of neoliberalism and the ideology, it does impact on your clinical care, and there's a lot of pressure, and I think it's really important to be reflective of that. So there's a lot of pressure, particularly on the CMHT, to get throughput and caseloads, to get people discharged, moving through services, because there are sort of constraints on money and funds, and this will never go away. And one of the reasons why I'm really interested in research is how can we kind of work in between that, this pressure on money and the neoliberalist ideology is never going to go away, but how can we sort of make services more effective, so we can then, rather than just sort of pushing people through for services and say, you're better, you're feeling better, just don't worry about that, just sort of get through, that we can actually make services more effective, so we can sort of offer a balance really there.
because it can almost feel like we're punishing people for recovering. So as soon as someone starts to feel better, we just withdraw all the services, kick them out the door, and then wonder why it doesn't work out. And I'm happy to say that people on Twitter are actually joining in answering the questions now. So you have some reinforcements panel. We have someone in terms of the question, why do people resist services? Randy has written in, they're afraid they'll feel weak or they may get into trouble for feeling a certain way. And I think you can understand why people have that feeling. It depends where you live and how you were growing up. Absolutely. Oh, thank you very much for that. I really appreciate that. So I hand back over now to Mick.
Okay.
Who looks shocked.
I think Vanessa wants to come in as well, but I just wanted to roll back a little bit, the bit about why people refuse services. I think the elephant in the room is compulsion. So when you don't give people any choice about services, particularly forced treatment, I think that's a big reason why people get alienated and turned off by even the nice, caring people. And most of my colleagues are nice, caring people, but they're also the people who put hands on people, inject people when they are literally fighting to not have it. So I think there's obviously much more to it than that, but I think that's a good starting point for thinking why people might begin to be alienated from services. And I think those processes do us harm, the people who work in services as well, and that probably needs more time. I think one of the questions is about neoliberalism, wanted us to actually say what it is. So just for the sake of it, it's a political economic doctrine that came in the late 1970s, and anyone in this country would recognize it as associated with Thatcherism. It was about the privatization of the welfare state, deregulation, so less rules about things like safety. And it also ushered in a form of managerialism that got called New Public Management. The people have mentioned obliquely sort of things like targets and all this sort of stuff rather than relationships. And a little anecdote, the very first country in the world to operate a neoliberal regime was the Pinochet regime in Chile. And that was actually Thatcher and Reagan. And it was actually a huge natural experiment to show that this sort of political economy could work. And by work, I mean work on its own terms, because a hell of a lot of people got put out of work. But I'll stop there because I could go on all day. But if anyone wants to know why we might object to neoliberalism, it started with one of the most nasty regimes in the world, which tortured people, including nurses. So I could go on for a moment.
Vanessa's got a question for Elisa, I think. I saw it in WhatsApp.
Mute myself. Yeah, no, I'm just interested in asking, because it might be useful in terms of people who are listening as well, because we've talked about complex trauma and you made some really important points there. So I'm thinking, linked into that, where does that fit in terms of services being trauma informed?
I think services are trauma informed, but I think people, for me, and I don't know if this answers your question or not, the trauma that people have experienced, the trauma that our patients, clients have experienced, gets lost in the idea that someone has a disorder, someone behaves in a certain way, they may and again, I don't want to say this in a kind of a judgmental way of my colleagues, because I'm a part of this service that really struggles to offer a service to people who have a traumatic past, that gets lost behind sort of a lot of the difficulties, interpersonal difficulties. People might be seen as manipulating, trying to control services, trying to control what's going around them, and thinking about sort of these behaviours that people sort of experience are actually to do with people's ability to survive quite sort of challenging sort of past and surviving through abuse, adversity, and then they sort of meet services, and that sort of interaction continues. So thinking about sort of services that remember that people have traumatic pasts, I worry that those things get lost. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. I think it links to a lot of what Sarah was alluding to earlier about some of the sort of social inequalities and injustices, because it's about us all being aware of our privilege, isn't it? Because we might not think that we're not acting in a way that's trauma informed, but just simply speaking in a certain tone of voice to somebody who's experienced coercive control or any other form of trauma can be really triggering for people, can't it? And I think, being aware of our, like I say, again, really our own privilege, where we come from, who we are, whether that's, race, ethnicity, gender, whether we're working class or middle class, all those factors, I think, we don't talk about enough, but we certainly, I bring it in every week because I've worked in the prisons, and I always like to bring in a prison perspective, because I think it's really important, because often people in prisons' voices aren't heard. But for me, that's where, it's particularly noticeable, I guess, some of the inequalities and some of the issues around complex trauma in particular. And often people, we've talked about people with, diagnostic labels, but sometimes people aren't labelled, they're just labelled as having complex trauma. Do you think that we could get into a position in the future where complex trauma becomes another label pathologically?
We could do, yeah. I think it would help people, people who work in services to remind them of the trauma aspect, because I think we on a day-to-day basis we lose that. Whether it would be good, or if it would just be another label which would be counterproductive, I don't know. But I do think we need to have more recognition of the social inequalities that people we work with have experienced over the years.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
Okay, we're running out of time, and I'm going to turn to all of the panel and ask them for a closing statement. I just want to throw Danny Taggart's name out there as somebody who is a survivor of trauma, a therapist and a researcher, and has developed some, I think, really interesting ideas to escape that trap that Vanessa has just raised. And it does relate to what Nick was talking about, and the question about social constructionism, because I think what I take from social constructionism is that the language that we have isn't neutral, and the things that we take for granted are actually brought into being by the language that we have. So we know people as survivors or mental patients because that's how we think and talk about them.
Yeah.
What Danny Taggart does is he says that leads us easily into a trap of think of ourselves as one thing and different people as another thing. And his philosophical solution comes from a philosopher called Levinas, and it's to demonstrate a duty to the other, which in a way explodes this idea of otherness. But anyway, it's time to sort of wrap up. So if we can go in the order that we started with, and maybe finish up with a few closing comments from each of our brilliant guests here. So can I turn to Elisa first? Just to sort of say, I've really enjoyed the discussions today, and it's really been helpful how everything's sort of interlinked. I think that the theme around language and in the importance of language and the sort of power behind language is really important. It's something that I've always tried to sort of bring in my head and in my own practice moving forwards. And I think sort of in terms of my review, I'd like to see more in research around sort of understanding, people's traumatic history, thinking about how we talk about and use language, not only in clinical care, but in research. I think it's really important. Okay, so on over to Nick.
I think there's many things that can be said, but if I just have this one moment to say something, it would be just to voice my opinion that the concept of recovery should be reclaimed, should be rescued from colonization. And I know that because of the colonization and abuses of recovery, that some people understandably want to get rid of the concept altogether. But I think that it's a hugely valuable concept within mental health, and particularly within the addictions side of things. It's a precious label which can be used to as a sign for hope, really, in otherwise seemingly intractable circumstances. So that's the one main thing I would like to say. Thanks. And over to you, Sarah, for the last word.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed just listening in and learned a lot actually throughout the session. My last word would be that I think the digital health as a tool offers some promise, but it's digital health apps and other digital tools should not be used as a reason to exclude people from services. They should be used to give people a choice of another way to engage with interventions, but not to replace the clinical and kind of human element of our services.
Absolutely.
That's brilliant. And I suppose what I've took from the whole of our discussion, and I think it's been so engaging, we could have carried it on for another hour at least, is that the panel and the people who are interacting with the panel are full of creative and imaginative ideas for what we might do better. And I just wanted to make sure that we understand that's not the same as saying we think everything's really, really bad. I think there's really good stuff going on, but we can always do better, and we need that imagination to do, to take us forward in that regard. So it's a hopeful stance, as Nick said. I think hope is a great virtue. It's also the last refuge of Evertonians, and that's where I'd like to rest. That was a football joke.
Oh. Well, on that, I think the other thing I would like to say is please make sure, if you're watching, to have a look at the presenters' work on their videos. It's so interesting. I mean, I love what Sarah was doing with looking at mobile technology and absolutely not uncritically as well. And that's what I really enjoyed about that one. And as well, Nick is so good. He's actually answering questions that are from Ben, so tomorrow's panel lead, before they're asked on recovery. So that's how clued in he is. And I think I've really learned a lot as well from Melissa about understanding just the power of language, because you see this all the time. People say it's just words, it's just words. It's not when they're about you or somebody that you love. They're not just words at all anymore. So thank you ever so much for people who've been supporting this. I'll hand over to Vanessa now. And thank you very much, everybody. Particularly the students who joined in. Thank you.
Yeah, I think just really echoing what everybody said. I think it's great that we've started MHNR with a subject about humanity and about inequality. And I think it's brilliant that we've managed to bring this conversation online this year, because of course, we're in danger if we only have this conversation at conferences that only, a small demographic of people attend, that we're having a privileged conversation, aren't we? So it's brilliant that it's been online and that we've been able to share this conversation with everyone. And I hope that, people who are watching online, either now or later, will join the conversation. This isn't the end of it, it's the beginning of it. We're here for, this week and next week, and do keep, tweeting us and commenting on Facebook. And we'd love to involve, as many people as possible. And like Nikki says, it's been really interesting. Tonight we've had a great panel, and Mick, brilliant chairing tonight, and some great questions there. Fantastic. And I think that's it really, isn't it, for tonight? And we'll be back tomorrow.
Yeah, so good night, everyone.
And good night.
Leave it now, Mummy.